The Roman grain dole is an excellent example of dedicated reformers turning an initially impossible vision of a more just society into a successful program with a monumental influence that is felt even today. Over the course of a century, the program grew from small subsidies for the very poor to eventually providing free grain and later bread to 200,000 of Rome's adult male citizens at its peak. The Bible may tell us that man should not live by bread alone, but many Romans were forced to rely on it for the bulk of their diet, meaning that in the less economically sophisticated world of antiquity, the dole was more akin to a comprehensive universal basic income program than a mere nutritional assistance initiative. During the Republic, oligarchic forces had long derided the dole and its recipients, and made no secret their desire to end the important social program. However, such was the popularity of the dole that they only succeeded under the reactionary dictatorship of Sulla. The victory of Caesar and the popular faction in the Civil War, a generation later, meant that the fate of the dole was never again in doubt. Caesar's successor Augustus was not cut from the same populous cloth as his adoptive father, but he saw the wisdom in not just maintaining the dole, but extending it beyond what Caesar himself had offered. While originally reserved for select recipients, Augustus allowed for the natural growth of the grain dole and admitted all sons of Roman citizens once they reached the age of 10. This trend toward greater social spending would lay the groundwork for the alimenta programs of Nerva and Trajan that subsidized additional food and even education for orphans and the very poor, and could be regarded as the first ever attempt at a comprehensive welfare program. Though the grain dole was impressive in scope, especially for its time, we must remember that not only were benefits confined to the male citizen body, which made up a fraction of Rome's population, but the funds and grain were obtained through brutal exploitation of the provinces. While we can wring our hands about that today, no one alive 2,000 years ago was giving it much thought, and it was considered a mark of pride to receive the grain dole, as it distinguished citizens from Rome's resident aliens and slaves. Recipients of the dole would even sometimes mention this privileged status with pride on their tombstones. Rome's citizen grain dole represented the triumph of centuries of efforts by populare reformers, many of whom are lost to history. Though assassinated campaigners like the Gracchi and Saturninus are well known, we must not forget that there were thousands of plebs who fought alongside these men and died just the same, without being immortalized by historians. Plebeians were certainly conscious of this, and during the late Republic, they had a reverence for the dole that bordered on the religious, as well as an expectation that it would be maintained and defended. Augustus would play on this attachment to the dole as he worked to portray himself as reinvigorating Rome through the newfound religious devotion of his regime. He would generously expand the dole, understanding that it was an invaluable tool to placate the urban poor and prevent further cause for popular reform. The move to tie his policies to the gods was natural in a society with no clear distinction between sacred and secular. In fact, cura annone, the term used to describe the import and distribution of grain, was Latin for care of Annona, a new goddess created by Augustus's propaganda. The name Annona is derived from the Latin term for yearly means of subsistence, and as the divine personification of the grain supply, she took on aspects of the goddess Ceres, whose temple was where distributions of the dole took place. Located on the Aventine Hill, the Temple of Ceres had long been the sacred center for the patron deities of the plebs, serving as the headquarters for the plebeian aediles and also holding plebeian records. Ceres was also the guardian of laws, so her temple housed written copies of all laws and senatorial decrees, which made it the place plebeians went for legal mutual aid to make sure that they were not being exploited by the upper classes, who long had a habit of fabricating arcane laws to use as leverage against the less educated and overwhelmingly illiterate urban poor. By subsuming Ceres, the goddess of the mobilized plebeian elements, into the new goddess Annona, and turning her into a representation of his own benevolence, Augustus seized the radicalism implicit in the grain dole and directed it towards further support for his regime. So tightly would he connect this new goddess with his own personal desire to care for the people, his genius, and his own growing sense of imperial divinity that she would go on to be worshipped as Annona Augusti. Despite her recent addition to the pantheon and absence in the foundational myths of Rome, Annona would become one of the key entities in the emerging imperial divinity cult. This tight connection would become a double-edged sword for his successors, because if bread became scarce or too expensive, then the emperor was the natural scapegoat, and not even the emperor was safe from popular rage if conditions got bad enough. His heir Tiberius understood this, saying that neglecting the cura annone would lead to the utter ruin of the state, by which he meant the principate regime, which had supplanted the republic. A riveting passage from Suetonius relates how the Emperor Claudius was nearly killed in a grain riot. When there was a scarcity of grain because of a long-continued drought, the Emperor Claudius was once stopped in the middle of the forum by a mob and was so pelted with abuse and pieces of bread that he was barely able to escape to the palace by a back door. After this experience, he neglected no means of bringing grain to Rome, even in winter. Though there was no longer a need to seek out votes from the plebeians, the ruling class knew the importance of keeping them well fed and arranged for a regular supply of grain to ward off any demonstrations from the urban poor. This, along with free entertainment, would form one half of the hegemonic superstructure for maintaining control. This was immortalized by Juvenal in the phrase, bread and circuses. The transition from a republic plagued by civil war to an empire which conducted its wars in border territories led to a boom in population, with the city of Rome growing to 1 million residents in the 2nd century AD. This era of supposed peace and prosperity would be deemed the happiest era in human history by Gibbon in his influential history of Rome's decline. But the precipitous lives of the vast majority of those million Romans tells a far different story. The durum wheat, which was made into bread, was by far the most important element in the Roman diet, and the most important sources for grain during the Republic were Sicily, Sardinia, and northern Africa. But it was the addition of Egypt during the Principate which made it viable to provide free grain for Rome's growing population. The logistics of the grain trade are truly impressive, requiring hundreds of ships on constant journeys across the Mediterranean, as well as robust infrastructure in place at the port of Ostia to collect the vital cargo and distribute it in the city. During this era, Rome needed roughly 40 million modi, or 272,000 tons of grain per year to feed its people, with about 30% of this amount apportioned to recipients of the grain dole. To put the imperial logistics into perspective, we must remember that no city in Europe would achieve the necessary infrastructure to feed 1 million inhabitants until London in the 19th century. Throughout most of the Republican era, managing logistics associated with the grain supply was one of the defining responsibilities of the aediles. However, from time to time, a special administrator, called the praefectus annone, was given vast power to ensure that the city continued receiving grain. The importance of this position can be seen in the vast powers entrusted to Pompey in 57 BC to maintain the grain supply. The Senate entrusted him with 15 legates, and Pompey was given the funds necessary to win over the local elite in Sicily and North Africa. The clientships that Pompey secured helped strengthen his position as a counterweight to Caesar, and he drew support from these regions during the Civil War. As such, Augustus recognized the immense power of this office, and when he made it a permanent administrative post, he decreed that under the Principate, all future praefectus annone were to be members of the economically oriented equestrian order, instead of politically prominent senators. Just as the grain dole was a privilege reserved for certain residents, the select merchants that participated in the grain shipments were granted unique privileges. Their cooperation was of the utmost importance, so they were offered citizenship and exempted from certain taxes. There were also tremendous economic incentives to consider. since for much of Rome's history the vast majority of the city's grain was governed by the market alone, prices were always higher than in smaller municipalities, and the grain merchants made a consistent profit. The dole thus resulted in a transfer of state funds into private hands. But further damaging to the case of those who seek to present the dole as a foundational left-wing program in antiquity is the fact that grain was obtained through exploitation in the provinces, often collected in lieu of hard currency, and some of which was distributed to the very soldiers occupying the provinces. In addition, the imperial dole was far from an example of socialism in action, because it was always grown on privately held estates, and then imported and stored by private business interests that expanded operations through loans and not direct state subsidies. Millers naturally benefited tremendously from the ready supply of cheap grain, as did bakers. With most of the urban poor crowded into tenements that banned all cooking as a potential fire hazard, many recipients were forced to give some of their allotment to Rome's industrial bakers for the privilege of actually making their grain edible. This made the dole a powerful economic engine, and in its heyday it provided a substantial income to those fortunate enough to hold the right contracts. This rent-seeking diminished the dole's initial radicalism, but also ended calls from the wealthy to end the program. With demand for grain so high, and all male adult citizens eligible, there is evidence of a significant black market in grain tickets that wealthy or upper-middle-class Romans may have sold to others more desperate for the free grain. Contrary to the belief that the dole made Romans soft and inculcated a sense of sloth that led to the collapse of the empire, there is ample scholarship to suggest the opposite. In the apocalyptic times of the 3rd century, it was the robust trade networks which had been built up to feed the people of Rome that served as a unifying force when political instability and runaway inflation wreaked havoc on the empire. In the decades that followed, Rome itself was abandoned by the governing class, and new capitals sprung up across the empire to accommodate Diocletian's tetrarchy. With production and supply increasingly oriented towards local concerns, the unified vision of the West would falter, and the fading memory of the Roman grain dole would presage the gradual end of the empire itself. Like the end of the empire, the end date for the dole is difficult to pronounce with any certainty, but it may well have continued into the 6th century after the Ostrogoths had seized Rome and deposed the last emperor. The grain dole would continue in the east until 621, after the Sasanian conquest of Egypt made it impossible to obtain the grain required to feed Constantinople for free. Interestingly, the Christians of the Byzantine Empire would continue to refer to the dole as the cura annone, despite its connection to the pagan goddess Annona, an indication of just how fundamental this system of grain distribution was to the capital of the new empire, and how Augustus's propaganda resonated even centuries after his death.